assuming your Office 365 data is automatically backed up can feel a lot like this.
And once again, ladies and gentlemen,
Backing up Office 365 data with Veeam feels like this. So back it up with Veeam.
All right, let me share my deck and we'll get this show started. All right, sorry about that, clicking around too fast. So first, I'd like to point out that as you've heard probably throughout the day, we are trying to support this charity. And so I put the link in chat. Please consider submitting a donation. We also want to thank our sponsors. They are what helps us to produce this conference and to get all the technology in place and get everything going. And so we have this slide where we want to call them out. So thank you for joining me today. It's the end of the day. It's the last session of the day. Typical if you go to conferences, IT conferences for government sessions. So this session was going to be Powerapps and Power Automate in GCC, the government community cloud, and the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I do want to give a shout out to my friend Sean Bugler. If you're not familiar with him, he is a big person in this space. And him and I were going to do this jointly, but he had an engagement to do with his mother. So I want to thank him for helping me with some of this content, though. My name is Jeremy Wood. I am a federal employee. I work for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which I'll explain a little bit about in a second. I'm also a podcaster. I have the podcast, The Geek Within. If you see my video, it's in the background. And it's a podcast where I interview people about how they got into IT, what was their journey into an IT career. And I'm also a user group lead for a local DC government-related user group, but I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to a slide for that. So what is the Millennium Challenge Corporation? So many of you have probably never heard of this agency. It's a very small agency. We're 300 people. It's innovative. It's independent. It is in the foreign aid space. We do foreign assistance to help lead kind of the fight against global poverty. It was created by Congress in January of 2004 with a very strong bipartisan support across Congress, which has helped us weather the storm agency to agency, or each time we have a new administration. MCC has helped change the conversation on how we deliver smart foreign assistance, and we focus very specifically on good policy, country ownership, and results around time-limited grants that promote economic growth. So we'd like to make sure people have heard about us because it's an interesting story. It's a unique story within government. And we do very specific investments that are not grants. We don't give the money away. They are a grant, but we don't give them the money and hope something happens. But we're very intimately involved in helping to kind of produce a better economic environment in these countries. And you can find out more about my agency at mcc.gov. But I mentioned the agency because we are very small. We are 300 federal staff, another 200 to 300 contract staff. Within my office where I work, I'm in the IT department, we have 9 actual employees who run the entire IT department for our agency. And then we have a variety of contract support. You can tell as an agency, we will need a large amount of contract support to execute the mission, to do all the normal IT support you would do for any organization. And so because the agency is small and our budget is small and we have small numbers of people, we have a whole lot to do and we want to be highly efficient in how we do it. And that brings us into this topic of the tools that exist within the Power Platform. So the Power Platform is something we want to leverage because things like Power Automate, which we'll talk about, it allows us to use flows to create these business process automations or instant flows or scheduled activities that take away the human element and make things more efficient. Powerapps, huge in the government space, if for nothing else, that it's an info path replacement. If you've been around the block, have been around for some time, my agency heavily leveraged InfoPath as a forms technology, implemented into our on-prem SharePoint environment, and it really underpinned many of our business processes. It was a very inexpensive way to develop those business processes and to capture that data in a way that was compliant with our records management and just helped us to get our business done. Amongst the Power Platform, There's also the Power Virtual Agents, which is the new kid on the block, especially for government, because it's just now coming to the government cloud. And it's going to bring bots and ways for us to provide further automations and reduce some of that overhead of manual processes. And then finally, Power BI, which has been around for a while, and we'll touch a bit about the differences within the government space, but it lets you visualize your data. So if this is the Power Platform that we have available, just like the commercial side does. But there are big differences in how these tools are implemented within the government community clouds. And there are 3 government community clouds, and we'll go through them here shortly. But and so from the worst possible situation, what we have within the admin center, in a typical environment, you can go in and request some level of support. And I want to tell you that doesn't really work within the government space. In fact, my agency found the only way to really get support was to actually have a separate contract with Microsoft Premier Support, where we could leverage a TAM and we could push some buttons and try to get things done. Besides that, heavily rely on our contractor, the company that we buy our Microsoft products through with our Microsoft Enterprise Agreement, who they themselves can have reached back into Microsoft to kind of shake some trees and maybe get us some help. It's a very difficult process. You'll be ready to, like this slide says, say the same thing 100 times when you're trying to get support. And so support is very lacking within the government space in comparison to what some of our commercial friends experience. If you're like me, you like to watch technology trends to see the latest features, the latest products that are coming out. Don't pay attention to them if you're going to work in the government space. So there are 3 community clouds, or 3 government clouds within Microsoft space. We have GCC, which is the lowest, the government community cloud. We have GCC High, which adds some additional compliancy rules. And then there's the DoD cloud, which is very locked off from the rest of the world and meets very specific DoD requirements. And the way they release products into these different clouds, you can expect a 3 to 6 month kind of lag time between the time, at least between the time it hits the commercial and the time it gets to GCC. I would say even longer. Now they've shortened those times, so I'm saying 3 to 6 now. If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said potentially a year. But since COVID, the teams have done a really good job of trying to accelerate the delivery of some of these products, especially those that can impact and make things better in a remote work situation. But as you can see by my chart, what's happened is it first goes to commercial, then it will get translated into GCC, then GCC High and DoD. Now, sometimes GCC and GCC High can get it at the same time, and that's very nice for those of us in the government space. If you want to try to keep track of what's going on, typically Microsoft will say, hey, check out our Microsoft 365 roadmap. This is where you can go and see, what's upcoming, what's going to roll out. And the roadmap does support government. Under cloud instances, you're able to select GCC, GCC High, and DoD, or whichever one's most applicable to you. But don't expect to see much about the Power Platform in the roadmap. Teams has done a great job, but the Power Platform team has not been dedicated to updating the roadmap with things that are relevant to government. I would say that Power BI, amongst the Power Platform, is probably the best and has begun to implement things onto the roadmap so we can see when they're coming. But most of the teams have not yet adopted this and put it out in any meaningful way for government users. I would say you're much better off looking at docs.microsoft.com. They have specific pages that they update on a pretty regular basis that are related to the capabilities and limitations within the government community cloud for those products. And that's where I get a lot of the material for this particular presentation. So if you're a Power Automate guru and you love to do automation and use the different connectors to get things done, be prepared to be disappointed in the government environments. Commercial has 477 at last count connectors. GCC has 137. And DoD outright has none. They have no access to Power Automate. And as far as we can tell, it's still on the roadmap, but it's not there yet. Note that third-party connectors will not be added to GCC High because of the compliancy requirements around it. So they will only ever have Microsoft connectors. GCC, on the other hand, does have access to third-party connectors, but according to Microsoft, only the most popular connectors in use in the commercial service, and that's based on usage telemetry, not just on word of mouth. Those are the ones that will make it over. And so they really encourage you to contact people you know within the Microsoft space and those teams to request those connectors if one is available in commercial and it's not available in GCC. Powerapps is very similar as well. Powerapps templates in government. There aren't a whole lot. Now, I have here a question mark because it's really 4. And I just looked at it today and I just forgot to update my slide, but we have like 4 templates in GCC when it comes to Powerapps. Powerapps has gotten the least amount of love in terms of some of the capabilities pulled over into the government community cloud, but it is there, it is usable, and we'll talk more about what that means for us. So it is still very much a blue sky application within the government cloud, rather than leveraging templates to have a starting place to begin your development. So those are the things that were ugly. Those are the worst of the worst. Now let's talk about the bad. Now, those of you who I've already seen the pictures. These are all pictures of buildings in the in Washington DC area where I work, the government buildings, and I should have pointed out when we were on the ugly slide. They are illustrative of the vote ranking on how pretty these buildings are within the DC area. So this one here is kind of the mediocre, the Hubert Humphrey building for HHS, Health and Human Services. So in the commercial area, you have the ability within to embed Powerapps within Power BI reports. That is not available within the government community cloud. And it's really kind of a shame because the capabilities of Power BI are so huge. And when you implement the Powerapps, kind of embedded into that, it then allows you to manipulate and interact with the data even further than you can in a regular Power BI dashboard. Now we have the regular Power BI dashboard with some caveats that I'll cover soon. But no, we do not have this particular feature. We still do not have the ability to add Powerapps to Teams. So there were sessions today that I attended that were really, really interesting on adding Powerapps to Teams and leveraging the Dataverse for Teams, and none of that is available in the government space as of yet. And so we're still kind of on a wait and see mode. Now, there is an ability to add a Canvas app as a quick launch from the Teams app bar or as a tab, but not to add it as like a full-blown app in this methodology that Microsoft has implemented fairly recently. Powerapps do not have any of the geospatial mapping capabilities, so there's no interactive maps within the government community cloud. So you have to leverage another tool set within government, so it's disappointing. So at the moment, AI Builder, which is powered by commercial Azure, for now is not really available to government. Now I say that with some caveats. There are governmental entities, maybe municipalities at the local level or state level, who do leverage the AI Builder from the commercial version of Azure. Azure is certified at a very high level for some of the compliancy things required by government entities, much more so at the local and the state level. For the federal level, we have what's called FedRAMP, and it requires some very specific rules around data separation and data residency, which the AI Builder does not support at this time. So some of the most useful, enhancements in Microsoft 365 around the AI capabilities are inaccessible for us at this point. And like I said, Power Virtual Agents is coming soon. But having said that, the Power Virtual Agents is pretty costly as well. And if you've ever done any work in government agencies, the one thing they don't like to do, it seems, is to spend money on the things that you think would be the most intelligent thing to spend money on. So more than likely, it's going to take a while before we get buy-in to fund activities in this space. So Power BI. Power BI is kind of weird in the government space. So by default, when you have Office 365 or Microsoft 365 G3 or G5, The Power BI that's delivered for free, the free version of Power BI, is not in a FedRAMP cloud, meaning it's in the commercial instance, and if leveraged, will put your agency out of compliance. For that reason, most agencies have turned it off, and the only alternative is to buy Power BI Pro. And if your agency, my agency has done this, if you buy Power BI Pro, Microsoft then sets up a very specific environment for your agency in a FedRAMP, in a government-approved container, and then there's some additional configuration that has to be done within your Microsoft 365 environment to remap all of the links to that environment instead of the free one. And then, of course, make sure you don't turn the free one on. So it is available to get it in a way that is FedRAMP approved and government approved, but you have to pay that extra fee to get the paid for Power BI Pro. And here we are 2.5 years later after the Power Platform Admin Center has launched, and there is almost nothing in the Power Platform Admin Center for government. So the big secret that you need to know is by default, there's just no functionality there. You can go in and do environments, but if you're like my agency does not own Dynamics 365. My agency does not pay for the higher level Powerapps licensing. It's fairly expensive. So for my agency, it would cost quite a bit of money to add that, especially if we really leverage the Dataverse or CDS to build out Powerapps. It would the cost of that would escalate quickly in terms of the number of people we'd have to give access to. It's $40 a month per user, and any user who's going to use that app has to have that license. So it gets expensive pretty quickly, yeah, that's a shame. But the Power Platform Admin Center is far reduced from what is available on the commercial side. But having said all that, all those negatives of things we don't have, there's still a lot that we can do with a little creative thinking. So we don't want to, instead of focusing and fixating on what we can't do, we can take a look at the capabilities that we can do or some unique ways we can work around some of those challenges. So things that are getting better. So first of all, the Microsoft tech community, specifically the public sector portion of it, which is kind of hidden. If you go to the tech community, you can click on community hubs, special topics, and then you'll see public sector, select public sector, and that's where you'll get to the blog and to the forums that are specific to government. Sarah Gilbert, who works for Microsoft, she's the public sector community lead and does a fantastic job at really forcing people to write articles or blog posts to get content onto this specific to government. And that's her entire job, and she does it well. I interact with her quite a bit. She calls me out if I'm not putting stuff on there, and other people. So be aware that there's somebody who's dedicated to trying to build out that content for those of us in the government space. Also, the government is becoming a big focus within community resources. And by what I mean by that are community user groups. So I myself started over a year ago a Microsoft 365 for Government DC user group that focuses on the entire platform, from Azure to Power Platform to Teams to Active Directory, everything within that in the Microsoft 365 stack. We bring in speakers to talk about it from a government's perspective. So what can we do within this space that's innovative and creative and lets us leverage this technology? But there are also others. So there's the Microsoft 365 Meetup for Government, and they focus on many of the same topics, much more on the Azure side. They have the people who are organizing that are more Azure focused. There's the Power Platform DC user group, which I'm a member of and participate with. And then there's finally a monthly community call, Microsoft 365 Government Community Call, that I'm a part of. My friend Jay Leask, who's helping organize this conference in Chicago, Sarah Gilbert, who I mentioned as public sector, and then Rima Reyes, who is the Microsoft Teams for Government representative on the Teams engineering team. The four of us co-host a monthly live event on LinkedIn where we bring in a couple guests and talk about topics specific to how the government can leverage these technologies. So for instance, just as a kind of a shout out, next Tuesday, we're going to have an episode that's focused on how government can leverage mixed reality. HoloLens, the HoloLens project is kicking off for Microsoft, and they have things going on at the VA and in the Army. And so there's some really innovative approaches for how they can bring this mixed reality into real business processes. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pause for a second and let's see. Actually, but at the end of this presentation, I'll post links to those different groups so that if you're interested in taking part of them, you'll have access to those links. And then, as I said, when we talked about the roadmap, while it's 3 to 6 months, it's getting better. We should have hope. I would say the team to congratulate and clap on the back and buy a beer for would be the Microsoft Teams engineering. They continue to, and in many cases, release features in GCC at the same time they put them in to commercial. Not all features, not all the time. We're still waiting for webinars. We're still waiting for a couple other things, but they've done a much better job at communicating to the government community when those can be expected, what that looks like, and if possible, based on whatever the architectural components are underneath the feature, they roll it in at the same time they do in the commercial sector. Some other things that are good is the Powerapps and Power Automate mobile apps. Now, Power Automate's only supports GCC on the iOS device at the moment, but both apps can be put on a phone, and you can access GCC. So there's no way for us to know when it's going to be supported for Android, but otherwise, this is a big improvement, right? Then we can start to engage. So my agency has developed a Power App for taking pictures of facility issues, right? A door that won't lock, or a window that's broke, or whatever it is, coffee pot's not working, whatever it is that is managed by our facilities team. You can pull up their app, take a picture of it, and then submit it as part of the information that you're submitting to the team, and then they access that and take care of things. And that's the power of a phone, right? You get that extra camera capability, and it goes beyond that in terms of what you can do on the move. So it's positive that we have this available to us. Lately, we've had the Sharepoint Integrate menu, which is related to Powerapps and Power Automate and how they interact with lists. So from a list or document library now, you get this new menu experience in how you want to associate some sort of Power Automate or Power App capability with what you're attempting to do. So that's a positive. I've leveraged that for kicking off instant flows. So you have list items and you want to kick off a notification to somebody or some business process based on a document that's just been submitted, but you don't want to kick off. There's these things you got to be careful about. You don't want to kick off the Power Automate based on when the document's saved. You want to wait until the metadata has been populated. So there's a lot that you can do there, though, within document libraries and lists, and GCC has those capabilities. We also have approvals in Microsoft Teams, which it says May 21st. It's just been released as of like yesterday, so it's been a little delayed. But now we can, within the Teams application, have native approval through that activity pop-up whenever there's something for you to approve. And so this helps to then bring us back into Microsoft Teams as a single place to do business. And which I like, rather than taking them to the Power Automate hub and the approval section within Power Automate itself. Many users don't even know Power Automate exists. They do know that Teams exists, and then we're trying to drive them from an adoption perspective to leverage capabilities there and not jump out to other places. So this is a good thing. Now, Powerapps for mobile in GCC High is available now. I do want to point out that if you do leverage mobile apps at all when it comes to the government community clouds or any of the community clouds, any of the government environments, you need to educate your users on how to go in and change the region settings. By default, when you install any of these apps, they are connecting directly to commercial. And so if a user tries to log in with their credentials, they either will fail or it will create an instance within a commercial environment, a free commercial environment, rather than leveraging your agency's environment. So what you have to do is go in and explain to them how to, click on the gear icon and change the region setting so that instead of pointing to the global, you can point to your specific government cloud. And unfortunately, even for government phones where we can fully manage them, there isn't a really good way to configure that to automatically be set correctly. So it is an education that has to be passed on to the user. So let's talk about some real world impacts. And this is where I'm going to start talking about some of my personal experience and how my organization has leveraged some of these things and some of our challenges. So first of all, the version of Powerapps and Power Automate that comes with the Microsoft suite, the 365 suite. So my organization has G3. It does not provide you the Dataverse, right? That's an additional license you need to purchase. And as I said before, that's a $40 per user per month cost on top of whatever you're already paying for. Now, unless you already have, say, Dynamics 365. So if you have Dynamics 365 and you have licenses for everybody in your organization, but I think even within Dynamics 365, there was some variation in terms of which level of licensing you had, whether or not you'd get that extra capability for the users. So be careful and check that out to ensure you're going to get what you expect. So by default, you don't have the Dataverse, which is kind of a challenge, and it really will put you back in terms of the capabilities that you want to do. And you know, I illustrate this. I'm at an agency that can't afford that. We can't afford to pay an extra $40 per user in our environment per month. I think I did the math early on. It was like another $200,000 a year for us to get the licensing just for the staff we needed to access if we wanted to put some of the apps I'm gonna talk about here in a second. And that is just not within our budget. Our IT budgets are tight, right? Every organization's budgets are tight. And we're not able to expand our licensing to include that. We have other, you know, on the list of priorities for government expenditures, things like compliance and security kind of rise higher than some of the capabilities, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean you can't come up with another way. So my agency has deployed this app, and this is a screenshot of our app. And every government agency are required to track conference and event attendance by staff in order to capture who approved it, when it was approved, what's the cost, where are you going. You know, as an aside, the story for those of you who haven't been around for very long, there's an agency that I will not mention the name of who used to throw huge parties that sometimes included funding from corporate interests and sometimes included after-hour activities that aren't on the normal approved list. And so therefore, this kind of thing is required of all federal agencies now to ensure we're not doing repeats of past. And this is not a bad thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's definitely a good thing because we want to make sure we're good stewards of the tax dollars that the public pays, my tax dollars and your tax dollars. So no complaint in that. But because of that, we have this requirement that is a compliant effort for us. And so we do need to track these sorts of things. Some things I'll point out. This is driven off of list data, right? My agency does not have the Dataverse. So what are things to consider when you leverage list data? Well, first off, when you put your data in a site, a SharePoint site, you'll want to make sure that that is a regular team site, not a team site associated with a group. The group sites have a membership model and don't really allow easily to fine-tune those permissions without breaking a lot of inheritance and breaking the concept of what those groups are about. And we found from a best practice, and I do have a list of best practices, so hopefully I'm not getting ahead of something else I already have, but we have found that from a best practice perspective, each of our apps has its own site, which is basically its data store behind the scenes. Although we do create a kind of a home page and embed the app in a web page rather than making people go to the Powerapps portal to access the apps. So that's something to keep in mind is the data integrity and how are you going to leverage the data behind the scenes to power your application. It's unique, right? You're not going to have a relational database. If it's list data, it's a quasi-relational. You have to build those relationships in how you develop the application. You won't be able to leverage a built-in relational data model. Another application that we have, and both of these applications are used agency-wide, whether you're Depending on your role in the agency, you may have to use one or more of those, because not every event costs money, and some things our contractors go to, and we track all of that, whether they're contractor or federal staff. But everybody has to exit the agency, and so we have an exit form that we've developed, and this used to be an InfoPath form for us. The event and conference one was always paper-based, actually, and we created that to become more data compliant from a records perspective. But the exit form was an InfoPath form that we converted, and it has a very, I don't have it in this screenshot here, but it has a very detailed list of people, organizations that have to sign off when you leave the agency. And all of that is driven by an underlying list that has roles and roles assignments for various people within the organization who have to be the ones to sign off in that section. And then it has data lookup lists, and it has the data list that contains the data when this form is submitted and as it's completed. We use Power Automate behind the scenes to send notifications to remind different offices. In this case, it's not a workflow. We're very lucky in that respect, because there are limitations in Power Automate, period, whether you're commercial or government, where workflows will time out after a certain number of days. And I don't know about you, but most organizations I've worked at don't get approvals done in a timely fashion. I think this one would go a lot faster, of course, because it's exiting. But under other cases and other forms that we're converting, we're concerned about that. So we did not choose to use an approval workflow through Power Automate, but instead we're watching for data as it gets updated or not updated, and on a scheduled basis, we remind staff that there's an outstanding thing for them to take action on. And Power Automate works well, driven off of list data. So those are just two examples of forms my organization has put in place. But amongst our best practices, and I'm focusing really here on non-data first Canvas apps, because we don't have the higher level licensing. We're not building model-driven apps. We're not building anything but Canvas apps in our environment, or leveraging Powerapps as forms customizations on lists. So think about your architecture when your data model is a list. So as I said, you want to make, in our case, we're doing a single site for each application to store all the data behind the scenes. We can set up, in a regular team site, you have the ability to set permissions at a very granular level based on, contribute, edit, and so there's a lot more granularity in permissions, and those permissions flow into the app based on who's using the application and the data that's underlying it. We do a lot of flags within our data to then drive what shows up on the ends within the app for action. So a lot of flag-driven things rather than because it's much more difficult to do. Say we can't develop a relational data structure based on permissions. Consider your application naming conventions. We have, for each of our applications, we have 3 different iterations of our applications. We have the development as it's being developed. We have a UAT version where we do post that into a site and make it available with the permissions as we expect they're going to be in production. And then we have a production version, and we do rotate and do a deployment through those environments as we modify the application. And because of that, because they're all in the same environment behind the scenes, because we don't have Dataverse, we don't have Dynamics, we don't have multiple environments within the Power Platform, we use a naming nomenclature to identify which one's prod versus UAT versus dev. In many cases, we have apps that are going to leverage similar data. So for instance, my agency has an organization chart with the various offices, and so we have a site that's dedicated to enterprise lookup data, and in there we put the lists that have that data content. We also have many functions because every organization has its own org chart in terms of what office belongs to what department or however you're structured, and we've built that into our data, and we've also built a template, a basic Power App that new people in our organization who want to try to build a Power App can leverage, and it already has things like cascading drop-down lists for looking up organizational information. So pick the department, and then it filters the list to show the relevant offices, and you can copy and paste those items into your own app and leverage them rather than having to figure out how to develop them from scratch. Consider that if you're going to use Powerapps across your agency, there's this Powerapps allow prompt when people access the app for the first time that will pop up, and if the user clicks the wrong thing, the application will not work. The way around that, and I don't have it with me right now, but you can definitely look it up online. We found it online. Was a PowerShell script to disable that allow prompt, to basically, for our entire enterprise, say not prompt whether or not that application is allowed to execute within the browser context. So that's something you might want to consider doing. It certainly reduced our challenges with users and how to undo what they did. Amongst design and usage, just like what you would do within most environments, remember Powerapps has a default query limit. We learned this, especially when it's pulling from a list. I think it's defaulted to 500 items, and if you need it to be able to pull more than that, you need to go in and change that default. Many organizations, federal or governmental organizations, have acknowledgement screens for accessing applications. It's just a typical thing we have. Just logging on our laptops, we have a acknowledgement screen letting us know that we're being monitored and whatnot. And so, we recommend coming up with a standardized, screen for that pops up during the loading of the application and record, and lets you record that they've acknowledged what's going on within that application, or what challenge or what compliancy requirement there is. And then, of course, each of your organizations should work out your branding and how you want to implement branding across the board so your apps have some level of consistency. I highly recommend April Dunham's YouTube channel. She does excellent series on how to do branding, how to create branding that can be re-leveraged across multiple applications, because you put it into one screen, and then you bring that screen into each of your applications, and that brings in your colors and your sizes and your fonts and your logo and whatnot. And it's a very good best practice. And then remember that with your integrations behind the scenes, you're going to be doing integrations with Power Automate against your list, against email. So Power Automate requires you to do that connector and have an authentication related to that interaction. And it's really, really important that you understand that there's no such thing as a Power Automate service account. So I'm in the government, and it's probably the same thing outside of government. We are centralized IT, and we like to control everything. If we had had our way, we would not have turned Powerapps and Power Automate on for the entire agency. But when we went and created the event form and the exit form, we basically realized that we had to turn those capabilities on for the entire agency. We couldn't say you could access them without having the license turned on, which I love that. In fact, if you're at an agency and you're not getting a lot of traction on deploying these technologies, I highly recommend converting an InfoPath or legacy form-based solution, such as your exit form or something else that's simple, into a Power App, just to get agency leadership to love it, and then not to realize that means they got to now turn it on for the whole agency. It was kind of a little sly way we got this invited into our environment, and now lots of people are taking advantage of it for their own business processes. But one thing to consider when you have centralized IT, and so our centralized IT, we have a team who are developing these migrations from older InfoPath form technology into Power Apps. And once we finish that, of course, there will be new people who come up and say, hey, I have a process or a form I'd like to get created. And they're expecting the IT department to do it. Not every organization is going to have citizen developers who step up out of their space and take the time and effort to learn Power Automate and Power Apps. And I would say while Power Apps is low code to no code, it does not mean uncomplicated. There's a lot of things in there that you need to understand. There are a lot of concepts that are easier to understand if you were a software engineer like myself. I used to do C# and building business applications, and so even at that end, Power Automate or Power Apps sometimes confuses me, right? Some of the nomenclature and the naming conventions. So it's not by any means immediate that people will take advantage of these things, and so they're going to expect the IT department to somehow support them. And so we've been producing these things, which is great because then the other thing to consider within a governmental context is you have, or any context, you have critical business processes now that are driven off of Power Automate. Powerapps is leveraging the capabilities of that integration behind the scene. And that person leaves the organization and their account is disabled, and the functionality will stop working because the connector now can no longer authenticate because the account no longer exists. So something to consider, and this is what we did in my federal agencies. We created a user account, and it's a real user account because you can't create a service account to do this, but it's a real user account with a real license associated with it that we use to for all of these connections for the enterprise level solutions that we're developing. Some key things to remember within the government context. Most agencies have an automatic password expiration policy. We had to work with our security team to get an exemption to that password expiration because we couldn't have a critical business process stop working. And this was kind of a new to them because they understood that for service accounts. We've had service accounts in our local AD forever for scheduled processes running on servers. And they've had methodologies to understand how to manage those passwords or how to create very complex passwords and manage them in a password app. And so we had to introduce to them that we had the same need for an Office 365 account that had real licenses for Outlook, a real license for Power Automate, real license per Powerapps because it needed to access those things on the user's behalf. And so be prepared for that conversation. And it is possible. Our CISO finally really got to understand it, and so password expiration was disabled. Now, having said that, many government organizations also have a secondary thing that's not built into how AD controls accounts. But like in my case, my agency had a script that runs looking for accounts that aren't logging in. And accounts that you leverage for Power Automate, even though they connect to Outlook and online, and they connect to SharePoint, and they connect to whatever you're having them connect to, those connections don't count as a logon. And so in those instances, our account was still getting disabled. And so we had to work with our operations team who runs that, and once again, educate our CISO on that type of thing and walk back those restrictions and make it so that we could instead have it not automatically be disabled because it's not going to be logged onto. The only time it's ever logged onto is when we need to make a new connection, because you do need to log on to that as that account, go in and authenticate the connection, and then the token is saved, and then you're off and ready to go until you have to do the next password change. And then remember, when you change the password for this account, you do need to go potentially and update all of the connections. So those are some best practices and tips that I just wanted to pass along, because my agency has been in the throes of this for, well, at least since COVID started. We've been heavily migrating legacy InfoPath into Powerapps and kind of learning the road for the challenges amongst the non-Dataverse Canvas app solution set. So that's all I had to share today. I see I'm early, so I do want to emphasize, if you would like to support this charity, please do so, and don't forget about our sponsors. And then, of course, we're always looking for opportunities to receive feedback on the overall conference and on the speakers at the conference. So this is a QR code that will help you to do that. And then last, I wanted to share with you, and then I'll look for questions. And I think there's only a few of us in the room. I'll unmute you all, and we can even have a conversation. This is my social. I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn, and then I have, like I said, I have a podcast, The Geek Within. And then let me stop sharing, and let's see, on Teams.